Well, welcome to session 3 of our study of the Book of Ezekiel, this overview of the prophetic book. And here in session 3, we're going to look at Ezekiel's embodied priestly prophetic messages. Quite a title, Ezekiel's embodied priestly prophetic messages. We're going to look at these passages that involve his acting out particular messages from God, sometimes called the sign acts. Now, in Leviticus 23, we come across an interesting feast. It's the Feast of Booths. In Hebrew, it's called Sukkot. In fact, if you're going around areas or Jewish neighborhoods, you find at the time of Sukkot, people still practicing it, building little booths and living in those for 7 days. 15th day of the 7th month, usually mid-September, late September into October, even today, Jews will practice the Feast of Booths. And this is a period, 7 days of rejoicing before God, feasting and bringing offerings. But the central event of the Feast of Booths was building a shelter, building a booth. When I was in Los Angeles and I'd walk past the Chabad house on my way to the campus at UCLA, usually they would just use an easy up, but they would paste little like palm fronds and things to it to kind of make it a little more contemporary. But people would do any number of things to make their booths. And then they would celebrate in those booths. In the Bible, it talks about them living in them for 7 days. And what's very interesting is when you go to Leviticus 23:42, you learn this about the Feast of Booths. It says, "You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, in order that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Dwell in booths, but did you catch that? That your generations may know. I added a few words, in order that your generations may know. It's kind of a funny expression when you think about it. Why not just tell them that their ancestors lived in booths when they left Egypt? Wouldn't that work? Why not read a book about them and how their ancestors lived in booths? What does it mean, they shall dwell in booths, in order that they may know that the people of Israel dwelt in booths? Well, one theologian who has studied ritual and studied the way we use our bodies in knowledge, named Drew Johnson, says that this mixes up modern, exclusively cognitive and propositional approaches to knowledge with what the Bible is really after. You see, to ask the question, well, why not just tell them people lived in booths? That's thinking about knowledge in kind of a distinctive way. You see, Leviticus 23 isn't just about stating the truth of the fact that Israel dwelled in booths. Leviticus 23 isn't trying to justify that truth or show that it is coherent belief that Israel lived in booths. No, Leviticus 23 is having the Israelites embody the practice of living in booths so that they will understand the significance of that event to their own day. Does that make sense? Living in booths in order to know that their ancestors lived in booths was to say they're doing this so that they might see how booths relates to them. Interesting when you think about that approach to knowing. You see, humans are embodied souls. Now, not everybody thought that. Gnostics, for example, Gnosticism said that the body was bad. What was important was the spirit. You needed a special knowledge that would sort of transcend the localness of the body, and you have this sense that the spiritual has superiority over the physical. There's a modern approach to humanity called personhood theory that does something of the same thing. Personhood theory would say that the body is a scientific fact, but that's not the same thing as being a person. What makes somebody a person is having a mind and having a consciousness that makes them a person. And so one can have a body but not be a person. And can you see how this might be used? And those who are defending free access to abortion all the time, they would say, well, a baby may be a life, but it's not a person. And what matters is personhood, not life. Or in the transgender debates taking place, someone may say, well, my body may be male, but my person is something else. It's interesting how people can approach the body in such a negative way. Even Christians can fall into this. Some might suspect that what I do with my body isn't really as important as what I feel in my heart or what I perhaps know in my head. Even its best results, someone say, is communion really that important? Are the sacraments really that important? Why not just believe the message? Well, we begin this session 3, in this way because Ezekiel is the prophet who's most famous for performing these prophetic actions, these sign acts. Some have called them action prophecies even. And it's interesting that in Ezekiel 12, verse 6, and in Ezekiel 24, verse 24, God calls Ezekiel a sign. He says, Ezekiel, you are a sign. And several places of the book show him engaging in signs, being a sign for Israel in exile. And one of the most noteworthy places for seeing this is in Ezekiel chapters 4 and 5. Now, as we're looking at the signs that are covered in these two chapters, it's important that we kind of take an approach that will help us understand what's going on here. First of all, as we're looking at various sign acts that Ezekiel does, we want to try to identify what role the prophet is playing. He's almost like an actor here. Is he playing the role of God in a given action? Or is he playing the role of Israel as a nation in action? Is he perhaps playing the role of the enemy Babylonians? Or is he perhaps playing a role that it's like he's putting on a different mask at different times and playing multiple roles? Different sign acts show him doing different things. So we want to try to identify the role that he's playing in a given sign act. And once we've done that, it's valuable to try to translate the action itself, the symbolic action that he's acting out, into a corresponding historical event. And once we've done that, it's time to take in the significance of it. Stand back and admire, as it were. Although we're not just admiring, we're standing back and trying to say what is being impressed upon us through this action. Well, the sign acts that we find starting in chapter 4, it begins in verses 1 to 3 with a sign act of building a city model. Ezekiel is to take a brick or a plate of some kind and draw a city. And it's universally recognized that this is a picture of Jerusalem. But he gets to have a lot of fun here. It's almost like Ezekiel gets to return to being a little guy again. He gets to build a wall around it. You can imagine him getting the mud out and he's like smoothing it all over. He gets to build siege models and battering rams and a whole bunch of things. Put siege work against it. Cast up a mound against this model city. Oh boy, he's having a great time. And then Ezekiel is told to besiege the model. Ezekiel dramatizes the role of the Lord here. And he then, as the Lord is acting against Jerusalem, using the Babylonians. So again, kind of an interesting combination. He's besieging it. And we see him acting as the Lord, but also acting as the Babylonians, besieging the city. But then we have this interesting instruction in verse 3, and you take an iron griddle and place it as an iron wall between you and the city and set your face toward it and let it be in a state of siege and press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel. Here he is taking this griddle, this iron griddle. Now, many of you are probably like me. You think it's something from Weber. You go down to Home Depot, pick up this griddle. We're not exactly sure, but it does seem to be some type of cooking implement. Four times this word is used outside of this place in Ezekiel. And what is fascinating is to see how these iron griddles throughout the rest of the Bible occur in the temple. They're used only in temple rituals by priests. Several times the griddle is in fact used for food offerings and that sort of thing. So it seems very interesting that now we have Ezekiel playing the role of Yahweh in some ways, which is a priestly role. And now he's acting with priestly implements in order to set up a boundary, besieging, judging, and we have this sinful city. And so he is playing the role of the Lord in the sense of besieging the city, and yet he's also playing the role of the priest in setting up a priestly implement between God and the city. And then he sets his face, again playing the role of the Lord, sets his face now against the griddle. This griddle seems to be setting up a separation between God and the city. What might that mean? Now, some people have said he seems to simply be showing there's a gap between God and Jerusalem. And certainly there is. Jerusalem's being judged for their sin against the Lord. And yet, isn't it interesting that a priest, we talked about this a little bit in a previous session, Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest, who on his 30th birthday thought he was done with any occasion to be a priest because he was finding himself in exile rather than in Jerusalem, is now taking priestly implements and setting them up between an angry God and a guilty people. Now, it's a very subtle type of intercession, but it at least seems to be showing something of a mitigated judgment, a deflected judgment. We're going to learn more about how God does indeed mitigate his judgment against his people. But Ezekiel doesn't take us there yet. Rather, it gives us this interesting picture of a siege, and Ezekiel nevertheless placing this griddle. Now, this siege model kind of bleeds into the next sign as well, which we see in verses 4 to 8, where he is lying on his side. Here, God tells Ezekiel to lie on his side. He says, and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it, that is, upon your side. And he's told to lay there for 390 days on one side and for 40 days on the other side. 390 days he will lay there for the house of Israel, and 40 days for the house of Judah. Now, these numbers puzzle people for a few different reasons. A lot of people have noted that if he did this as a complete line of 430 days, he wouldn't have enough time to finish before the next things he's supposed to do in the date formulae. Okay, that's one of the problems. Some have recognized it seems that he is laying on one side for a portion of the day and going to the other side for a portion of the day, at least for 40 of those days. And then after he's done laying on his side for the days of Judah, he continues the remainder of the 390 days of Israel. But he lays there for 430 day periods, however that's going to play out. It is interesting that 430 is the amount of time Israel spent in Egypt. That's a time that some have suggested is the significance here. Others have wondered if 390 is perhaps an approximate picture that lasts between David's death and the beginning of the exile in 586. Or some have suggested that maybe it's a picture, a symbolic, almost approximate date between Solomon's death and the division of the kingdom until the return from exile in 539. Scholars go back and forth and wrestle with some of these numbers, but nothing really clicks perfectly. But what is key is this. He's tied down, verse 8 tells us, just like Jerusalem. He's not able to just move around. Jerusalem's hemmed in by a Babylonian army that's besieging it. And then we're told that he is to place the punishment, literally place the sin upon his side. And in another sentence it says he is to bear or lift the sin. And so Ezekiel here becomes a picture of bearing sin. Now, he doesn't bear it in their place. Israel will, in fact, be punished. The Babylonians will destroy the city. And yet he is playing a representative role, identifying with Israel, and playing a priestly role, identifying with them as a sin bearer, the way the priest would in the temple ritual. Well, that brings us to the next sign act, where in verses 9 to 17, we get the famous Ezekiel bread passage. You go to the grocery store and you see your package of Ezekiel bread. Well, often that's an attempt to rebuild the bread that Ezekiel is making here. Although what's interesting is if you buy Ezekiel bread in the grocery store, you usually buy a pretty good-sized loaf of the stuff. But most commentators note that in verses 9 to 17, the bread that Ezekiel is making is hardly a sustainable diet. He mixes these different grains together, and this is less than a half a pound a day of these grains, maybe about 2/3 of a quart of water per day. These are siege rations. And so here he is preparing a meal that's not going to last him very long, and it shows how dire is the situation. And then the sign goes on to tell him to bake it over human dung. Again, that is something that would be common of a siege when one can't just go into the woods and find firewood and one is trying to burn anything possible to cook food. Interestingly, Ezekiel objects to this, and he says in verse 14, not simply, Lord, this is gross, don't make me do this, but look what he says. Ah, Lord God, behold, I have never defiled myself. From my youth up till now, I've never eaten what died of itself, or was torn by beasts, nor has tainted meat come into my mouth. Then he said to me, this is God, see, I assign to you cow's dung instead of human dung, on which you may prepare your bread. You see, here Ezekiel is concerned for purity the way priests are concerned for purity. And verses 16 and 17 will actually go on to show what's going on here. And so he says in verse 16, Son of man, behold, I will break the supply of bread in Jerusalem. They shall eat bread by weight and with anxiety, and they will drink water by measure and dismay. I will do this that they may lack bread and water and look at one another in dismay and rot away because of their punishment. So his creating of a siege ration diet is a picture of what Jerusalem will go through as they are dealing with the aftermath of their rebellion. And then finally, the haircutting sign act. This is an interesting one because in verses 1 to 4 of chapter 5, we read of this action where he takes a sword and cuts his hair. But following that, in verses 5 through the end of the chapter, we have the lengthiest explanation of the sign act in the whole book. It is a very interesting picture, I think. He uses a sword as a barber's razor. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a straight razor used in a barber shop. Men more often, I think, than women deal with this, although maybe I don't know something. I'm not used to hearing my wife say that she went to the beauty salon and they used a straight razor for something or other. But men can have this happen. And let's be honest, those things are a little bit creepy. How much more so when you're using a sword as a barber's razor? Well, that's what he's doing here. And he cuts off all his hair. That is to say, he gets a great haircut. Okay, a few chuckles here about the speaker's own lack of hair. And what he does is he now scatters the hair. And yet he does this not just in a willy-nilly way, he does it in a way that will symbolize how the exiles are going to fare in the Babylonian attack on Jerusalem. Some of the hair he burns, because some of those living in Jerusalem are going to be burned to death in the grisly conflagration that will take place in the battle. He's going to scatter some away and chop a sword at them, because some of them are going to escape the city only to be killed outside the city. And then some will be scattered to the wind, because that's what happens to the exiles. They get scattered. In fact, when the northern kingdom was scattered, they were scattered so finally that one can hardly even tell that they exist anymore. And yet, even though he scatters them to the wind, he does take a small group and he tucks them into the hem of his robe. Some of those get pulled out yet, but there's still a segment of people, a small remnant, that is kept in the hem. God is preserving a people for himself. Now, on the one hand, this act relates to Isaiah 7, verse 20, which uses shaving as a picture of Assyria cutting away the northern kingdom. And on the other hand, the act affects Ezekiel's own haircut, something that happens at particular times for priests. Now, in the ancient Near East, there's numerous examples, same language of a barber's razor that occurs in several Phoenician texts. But also we find in the Bible that changing one's hair, cutting off one's hair, is a way to remedy impurity in the book of Leviticus. Cutting one's hair is something that takes place along with the commissioning of the Levites. And cutting one's hair is something that the Nazirite does when he is rejoining the community, the Nazirite being a priestly role. And so interesting, once again, Ezekiel is not only conveying something through his action, but he's embodying something of his own priestly identity. Now, there's some other signs in the book. Of note, there's one in chapter 12 about him pulling his baggage out through a hole in the house, preparing to go on his own exile, and that's to be a picture, a sign of the exile that the people are going to go through. And in chapter 24, we also have a sign of his wife dying, and yet him not being permitted to mourn. Now, that has actually confused some people because we think, is God being callous, not permitting him to mourn the death of his wife? Interestingly, it doesn't say he may not cry, but it seems to be invoking language where the priest, indeed the high priest, was not allowed to go into a state of ritual impurity for mourning. There too, we seem to see this priestly identity of Ezekiel playing out in these sign acts. Well, how do we take in the significance of these various sign acts we've just read about? Now, it's common to say that the sign acts are kind of like visual aids that help with understanding. And there's a measure of truth to that, although it's a little bit weak. Ian Duguid, commentator on Ezekiel, says that a better way of wording that is calling them effective aids. You see, the sign acts aren't just designed for the eyes, but rather they're aimed at the hearts and the wills. They're aimed at the seat of people's affections. And the sign acts are not just to help people see the truth, not just to illustrate the truth, but these sign acts are performed by Ezekiel so that those who are watching him will feel the truth and in some measure will experience the truth. The sign acts don't merely clarify the message, they drive the message home. Think of how extreme measures do this. During the civil rights movement, there were examples of bus boycotts where people would not ride the buses because black people were not allowed to ride the buses and sit in certain seats. There were other acts that were very decisive as black people would sit in at the all-white lunch counter. It gripped people's attention and forced them to note what was going on. People may know that Christians detest abortion. And yet look what these pro-life cross displays at local churches do. Look at what happens when groups of Christians gather and pray in front of an abortion clinic. It drives home the truth of the belief in a visceral way. The sign acts are gripping the audience. But the sign acts also affected Ezekiel personally. Again, we've talked about all these various priestly themes. Even though Ezekiel 1 verses 1 to 3 might have indicated or seemed to indicate that Ezekiel had missed his priestly calling, being at age 30, not beginning service in the temple as most 30-year-olds from priestly families did, but being in exile. And yet we saw in chapter 1 how God's temple presence, his glory, his kavod, we called it, came to Ezekiel. We saw that vision in chapters 8 to 11 of the kavod leaving the temple and going east, where we know it would eventually meet Ezekiel. And now we see Ezekiel undergoing rituals that are forcing him to play the role of a priest, albeit in unique ways. Ezekiel is a prophetic priest, and his message is going to reflect priestly concerns all the way through chapter 48. Well, what do we do with this? What might be our application? You see, God is interested in capturing our affections when it comes to hearing his word. He's not merely grabbing our attention and feeding us interesting facts in His Word, but He's impressing His truths upon our emotions. He's impressing these truths upon our hearts and our souls and our lives. And we're going to see an example in just a couple of sessions of a very powerful way in which God does that. But we see too that God is concerned for us as whole persons, and He reveals Himself to whole persons, body and soul. Of course, in the sacraments, God doesn't just tell us the gospel, but God makes us feel the gospel. God makes us taste the gospel and smell the gospel and indeed see the gospel in the sacraments. There are many ways in which we use our bodies as Christians to live out these beliefs.